Many of the world's religious traditions advocate surrender to God as a means of transcending the individual self. Sri Ramana accepted the validity of such an approach and often said that this method was as effective as self-enquiry. Traditionally, the path of surrender is associated with dualistic devotional practices, but such activities were only of secondary importance to Sri Ramana. Instead, he stressed that true surrender transcended worshiping God in a subject-object relationship, since it could only be successfully accomplished when the one who imagined he was separate from God had ceased to exist. To achieve this goal, he recommended two distinct practices: holding on to the I thought until the one who imagines that he is separate from God disappears, completely surrendering all responsibility for one's life to God or the self. For such self-surrender to be effective, one must have no will or desire of one's own, and must be completely free of the idea that there is an individual person who is capable of acting independently of God. The first method is clearly self-enquiry masquerading under a different name. Sri Ramana often equated the practices of surrender and inquiry, either by saying they were different names for the same process, or that they were the only two effective means by which self-realization could be achieved. This is consistent with his view that any practice involving awareness of the I thought is a valid and direct route to the self, whereas all practices that ignore it are not. This insistence on the subjective awareness of I as the only means of reaching the self colored his attitude toward devotional practices, Bhakti, and worship, which are usually associated with surrender to God. He never discouraged his devotees from following such practices, but he pointed out that any relationship with God, whether as devotee, worshipper, or servant, was ultimately illusory, since God alone exists. True devotion, he said, is to remain as one really is, in the state of being, where all ideas about relationships with God have ceased to exist. The second method, surrendering responsibility for one's life to God, is also deeply related to self-enquiry, since it aims to eliminate the I thought by detaching it from the actions and objects it habitually identifies with. In following this practice, there should be a constant awareness that there is no individual I who acts or desires, that only the self exists, and that there is nothing apart from the self that can act independently of it. When one becomes aware of assuming responsibility for thoughts or actions, for example, I want, or I am doing this, one should withdraw the mind from its outward focus and fix it in the self. This is analogous to what occurs in self-enquiry when one realizes that self-attention has been lost. In both practices, the aim is the same: to isolate the I thought and dissolve it back into its source. Sri Ramana admitted that this kind of complete and spontaneous surrender is difficult for most people. For that reason, he often advised preliminary practices to cultivate devotion and bring the mind under control. These included meditating on God or the Guru, visualizing the divine form, and repeating his name, japa. He assured his devotees that if such practices were done regularly, with love and devotion, the mind would be effortlessly absorbed in the object of meditation. Once this absorption deepens, complete surrender becomes much easier. The constant awareness of God prevents the mind from identifying with other objects and strengthens the conviction that God alone exists. This inward focus also draws grace from the self, a divine power that weakens the grip of the I thought and gradually dissolves the vasanas, mental tendencies, that sustain it. Eventually, the I thought becomes so faint that it can be made to sink temporarily into the heart through simple self-attention. As with self-enquiry, final realization is brought about not by personal effort, but by the silent power of the self. When all the outgoing tendencies of the mind have been dissolved in repeated experiences of pure being, the self rises and destroys even the faintest trace of the I thought, so that it never rises again. This final destruction happens only when surrender is completely motiveless. If one surrenders with any desire, for grace, realization, or any result, it remains only a partial surrender. It becomes a subtle transaction in which the I thought still acts, expecting a reward. True surrender is pure. It is not a bargain but a disappearance,